And so the lessons that Allison took from that, of course, it doesn't just happen over a 10-day period and it's over. And now we see what has happened in Eastern Congo, which is actually what Allison Deforge was focusing on now. Is that right? And Human Rights Watch just today has released a report.
Yeah, well, interesting. I mean, Allison, the last thing she was doing was really helping us prepare the report that was released today, which highlights a particular aspect of the conflict in Eastern Congo involving the so-called Lord's Resistance Army. And there actually are two parallel conflicts, one involving Rwanda very directly, the other more Uganda-oriented. But Allison was deeply involved in all of this work. And I think one real attribute of her was how principled she was, because even though she was the foremost chronicler of the genocide, even though she served as an expert witness some dozen times before the International Tribunal set up to try the genocidaire, she at the same time, as a matter of principle, did not want people to forget the crimes committed by what at the time was called the Rwanda Patriotic Front, the rebel group combating the genocidaire, which then evolved into the current Rwandan government led by Paul Kagame. That group murdered some 30,000 people during and in the immediate aftermath of the genocide. It then was responsible for massive slaughter in Eastern Congo. And Allison didn't want those crimes forgotten. She was pressing the Rwandan international prosecutor to this day to pursue these cases. And I think it's that action on Allison's part that led Paul Kagame to try to block Allison from entering the country over the last 6 months.
Now, Paul Kagame does get a lot of support from the United States, is that right?
Yes, I mean, I've been to conferences where Bill Clinton is squiring Paul Kagame around, and you can just see the guilt playing out. You know, Clinton did nothing to stop the genocide, so the least he can do is to usher around the president whose military force at the time was responsible for ending the genocide. But it makes me sick to see this, because Clinton, again, is, deliberately oblivious to the blood on Kagame's hands. And even though Kagame is widely admired as a good administrator, he's helped build up the country economically, this is a man who has presided over forces that committed mass murder, and he should be held to account.
Explain where that mass murder was committed and how it extends into the Eastern Congo now.
Well, the part that potentially could be prosecuted by the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda involves some 30,000 people who were killed in Rwanda during the genocide and in the immediate aftermath, not by the genocidaire, but by Paul Kagame's forces. Then in chasing the organizers of the genocide into Eastern Congo, at the time what was called Zaire, that action led to far more bloodshed. And indeed, Human Rights Watch has documented murder by Rwandan forces as far away as Kisangani, which is at the time a Zairean town that was, hundreds of kilometers away from Kigali. But this is, Paul Kagame is a man who has not stopped at mass murder when he saw it serving his political purposes. And it is sickening to see how closely Washington, London, and other European capitals still hold him, I think largely out of guilt at having done nothing to stop the genocide, but oblivious to the principles that Allison Deforge stood for, that no one should get away with these kind of atrocities, regardless of what they might have done with their lives.
And now Rwanda taking Nkunda, who is an ally of Kagame, and now saying that he is the enemy.
Well, there was a rebel force, a Tutsi-led rebel force in Eastern Congo that had been led by Laurent Nkunda. And a couple months ago, it was threatening Goma, the principal town in Eastern Congo, with, again, the possibility of massive bloodshed. Allison was very involved in putting pressure on Paul Kagame to rein in this force, and indeed he ultimately did succumb, arrested Laurent Nkunda, and has now arranged a sort of alliance with the Congolese government to allow the successor of this force to proceed against the Hutu militia who remain in Eastern Congo. The problem is that the successor, a guy by the name of Bosco Ntaganda, is himself an indicted war criminal, indicted by the International Criminal Court. And so once more you see sort of a compromise of convenience, ignoring justice for mass atrocities in the name of getting something done. And this too was something that Allison was working to reverse at the time of her death.
The UN has authorized a UN force to go in, but they haven't gone.
Well, in Eastern Congo today, there is a peacekeeping force of 17,000 called MONUC, which is actually the largest peacekeeping force on the planet today, but is inadequate to the task because it is such a vast area that it must cover. And so at the urging of Allison and others, the Security Council recently authorized the deployment of 3,000 more, but ideally 3,000 well-equipped rapid reaction troops who could actually protect civilians rather than simply watch them be killed, as seems to have been the case so far. That force has been authorized but not deployed. And indeed, what Allison was visiting European capitals for just before her death was to try to convince them to deploy particularly so-called European battle groups. These are forces that are precisely created for this purpose, but that the Europeans are refusing to deploy because they just don't want to get involved in Eastern Congo. So the end result is, whether it's the conflict involving Laurent Nkunda's former troops or the Lord's Resistance Army, the two parallel conflicts taking place in Eastern Congo. In each case, the main victims are civilians, and the international community has troops there, but is not doing what it takes to save these civilians.
When was the last time you spoke to Alison Deforge or folks at Human Rights Watch and what she was wanting right now from her trips and her conversations with the European delegates?
Yeah. Well, I was talking with Alison just in the week before her death, and we were
she was emailing a report right from the airport before she got on that flight.
She was always working. I mean, she was incredible, and she was so dedicated to the people of Rwanda and the people of Central Africa. But just in the last week, she was concerned about some people in the United States who are being unfairly accused of having been participants in the genocide, and NBC was doing a documentary that seemed to have been exploited by the Rwandan government to pursue these people unfairly. She was also in contact with Hassan Yalo, the chief prosecutor for the International Rwanda Tribunal, trying to convince him to go after Paul Kagame's crimes before his tribunal shuts down. So she had, a number of things in the work besides trying to protect the people of Eastern Congo.
She tried to get into Rwanda twice and was denied?
Yes. I mean, she had been going to Rwanda, forever. And in fact, Human Rights Watch has an office in Kigali. But beginning in September, when she would show up at the border, inexplicably she would be barred. And I remember calling the chief immigration officer and asking what was going on, and I would get, bureaucratic mumble jumble. But what was happening was that Paul Kagame, the Rwandan president, saw that the end game was coming with the Rwanda Tribunal, that it was going to be over the next several months that his fate was going to be determined and those of his allies within the former Rwanda Patriotic Front. And he knew that the principal proponent of justice for those crimes was Alison Deforge, and his pathetic effort at retaliation was to bar her from the country that she loved.
Ken, you were just in Washington around talking about issues like state secrets. What is this latest on the Obama administration twice invoking the state secrets privilege over the past 2 weeks, most recently in a closely watched spy case weighing whether a U.S. president can bypass Congress and establish a program of eavesdropping on Americans without warrant?
This was a huge disappointment. Clearly, President Obama has begun to change a number of the disturbing aspects of the Bush administration's counterterrorism policy, whether it's insisting on a single interrogation standard for the whole U.S. government and basically taking the CIA out of the torture business, or vowing to close Guantanamo. But there are some parts that either they haven't focused on yet, or they've made the wrong decision. And one of them is the one, Amy, that you mentioned, which is they seem to be continuing the Bush administration's policy of relying on the doctrine of state secrets to cover up inquiries by civil litigants into what went wrong with the Bush administration's policies, whether that's snooping on Americans or torturing suspects. But the Bush administration regularly used the claim of state secrets in order to basically block these sort of civil litigation efforts. And unfortunately, President Obama's administration seems to be continuing that practice. We don't know whether this is just continuing on autopilot or whether there's a deliberate decision that has been made, but it's been a big disappointment.
What else are you demanding now of the Obama administration?
Well, I was just in Washington talking in particular about the question of how do you close Guantanamo? Because the president has vowed to do so. He's begun a review of the cases there. And Human Rights Watch and others have been pushing him to adopt a policy of either prosecute or release. Clearly, many people there are there by mistake or are small fish and should just be released. Some of them are serious criminals, and they should be prosecuted in regular courts, not these substandard military commissions. The problem is that there are some in Washington who are pushing a third option. They want President Obama to continue having the possibility of detaining people without criminal charge or trial. And in our view, that would simply be continuing Guantanamo. It may be moved to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, or Florence, Colorado, but it'd be the same thing by a different name. And so we're urging the president to resist that, to adopt a clean policy of prosecute or release, but he's not there yet. I think he's leaning in that direction, but there's pressure coming in from the other direction, and we're trying to resist that pressure.
And what are you doing on Israel on the occupied territories with the latest assault on Gaza?
Yeah. Well, Human Rights Watch was barred from Gaza during the war, as was most anybody else. But we did have observers just on the outside who, for example, broke the story about Israel's use of white phosphorus, and they broke the story about Israel's use of these high explosive artillery shells, which basically can injure people within a 300-meter radius, an utterly inappropriate weapon to use in heavily populated areas such as Gaza. Right now, we have 4 people on the ground, and we are closely looking at how the war was conducted. And we're looking, obviously at the claims that Hamas was shielding or hiding among civilians, but we're also looking at the allegations that Israel was using extraordinarily excessive force, that it was firing indiscriminately, and that its claims to care deeply about protecting Gazan civilians were simply not true. We will be issuing a series of reports over the next few weeks with our conclusions, but this is a very deep preoccupation of ours at this stage.